Aldous Huxley. Now, the Tavistock Institute reportedly dabbled in LSD experimentation for several years, and it was spearheaded by the Brave New World author Aldous Huxley. Jim Keith actually evidenced this in his fabulous book Mass Control, World Control, which is another book that I would recommend people buy. Now, their aim was to actually introduce a euphoric drug very, very similar to the drug Soma that was spoken about in Brave New World, very, very similar to the drug Soma that Aldous Huxley's friend Gordon Watson brought back from Mexico. Now, in A Brave New World, the purpose of Soma was to sedate and elevate the mood, relieving all worries in the book. Soma was described as a hallucinogen which allowed users enjoyable, hangover-free holidays. Now, Huxley was actually privy to LSD experiments, not officially, but in his private memoirs, in his private letters, he's writing to such luminaries as Andrija Puharic, who was doing classified LSD experimentation, and various other people that were also taking part in classified MK Ultra experiments. Aldous Huxley was born the 26th of July 1894 and died on the 22nd of November 1963, the same day that Kennedy was assassinated. He was an English writer with a great influence in the popularisation of psychedelic substances, particularly in the academic field. Huxley actually edited the magazine Oxford Poetry and basically published a series of short stories, poetry, travel writing and film scripts. He was, very, very affluent in that sort of respect. He was actually educated at Eton, which we all know is very prestigious, and later studied at Balliol Colleges, which is one of the constitute colleges of Oxford. It's basically one of these places where the elite go. From its alumni has got 3 British Prime Ministers from this one college, for crying out loud. And he spent the rest of his life the last period of his life in Los Angeles, basically from 1937 until he died in 1963. This was apparently because the climate, he had an eye problem and the climate was much better. And basically one of the things he's most known for is advocating the use of psychedelics, particularly peyote, mescaline and LSD. During the 20s, Huxley formed a close friendship with the author D.H. Lawrence, with whom he travelled around Italy and France. Now, it was rumoured that the pair were lovers, and it's also true that both of them were members of the quasi-religious mystical sex cult called the Children of the Sun, or to give it its correct German name, because it was also Nazi, was the Sonnekinder. Huxley was also known to be friends with George Esserbrox and Louis Jolyon West, who were very, very eminent MK Ultra doctors. I actually live in the village where D.H. Lawrence was born, and it's called Eastwood. Now, I don't know if anybody understands the significance, the occult significance of the East Wood. It's the wood in the east where the sun rises. Now, by sheer coincidence, I'm sure, the logo for Eastwood Town, the council there, is a phoenix rising out of some fire. Now, Huxley actually worked briefly as a teacher of French at Eton, where one of his pupils was a young Eric Blair, descendant of former Prime Minister Tony Blair, but better known to you and I as George Orwell. Now, on the 21st of October 1949, Huxley wrote to Orwell, who had by this time already put out 1984, and congratulated him on how fine and profoundly important the book is. He said, "Within the next generation, I believe that the world's leaders will discover that infant conditioning and narco-hypnosis are far more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging them and kicking them into obedience." Yeah, get off you. In October 1930, Aleister Crowley, the English occultist and self-proclaimed most evil man in the world, was a dinner guest of Aldous Huxley in Berlin, and rumours persist that on that evening, Crowley introduced Huxley to the psychedelic delights of peyote. He was introduced in 1953 to mescaline by Humphrey Osmond, and it was through Humphrey Osmond that Huxley actually met the millionaire Alfred Hubbard, who we'll come on to in a minute. And he was one of these Johnny Appleseeds of LSD that was able to provide large quantities of pure LSD, seemingly from nowhere. Now, the thing about Aleister Crowley is that both the Beatles and the Doors have Aleister Crowley on the covers of their significant albums. There's a bust of Crowley on the back of, I forget whether it's LA Woman or the Doors, and Aleister Crowley is obviously in the cavalcade of characters in the front cover of Sergeant Pepper. Now, a lot of people, you might have heard this scenario, the concept that basically Sergeant Pepper might be about Aleister Crowley, the opening lyrics saying it was 20 years ago today Sergeant Pepper sought the band to play. It was 20 years to the anniversary of Crowley's death that the actual album was released, and so it has been sort of suggested. What is certainly true is that the Crowleyan concept of do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the war was later taken by the human potential movement and changed into the hippie mantra, if it feels good, do it. And it was taken directly from the Crowleyan thing. Sergeant Pepper, a lot of people wonder, is Pep a reference? They say Pep, Dr. Pepper, Sergeant Pepper, Pepsi. There is a theory that essentially it is in some way connected to the devil, or call it what you may. One thing that I have certainly found is that there is actually an evil Egyptian snake god called Apep, and so it could well be a reference to that. On the 24th of December 1955, Huxley took his first dose of LSD, and he was a pioneer of self-directed psychedelic use. He actually took 5 strong doses, or 100 micrograms, intravenously as he lay dying. His psychedelic drug experiences are actually described in the essays The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, which we actually spoke about later, and these were frequent readings among early hippies and later beatniks. Huxley said, "Let us consider another type of drug capable of making people feel happy in situations where they would normally feel miserable. By making a harmless chemical euphoric freely available, with a dictator could reconcile an entire population to a state of affairs to which any self-respecting human being ought not. There will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorships without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies. So that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but they will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods, and this seems to be the final revolution." And he made this speech for the Tavistock Organisation group at the California Medical School in 1961. Now, some people would basically argue that LSD was a revolutionary drug, and it did actually do some good, and you certainly can't deny songs, Purple Haze, I'm the Walrus, they're obviously very, very LSD affected, and these are great cultural moments, so you can't deny that. What is sadly not true, though, is any concept that any of the LSD movement was organic. And people will start citing the LSD cooks, the Johnny Appleseeds of LSD, the people that basically were seemingly going out there and for the betterment of mankind was spreading this new drug. Unfortunately, every single one of them has got connections either to the military industrial complex, intelligence agencies, or all of the above. One of these was Alfred Hubbard. Alfred Hubbard was he basically introduced Aldous Huxley to LSD in large quantities. He was basically one of these people that somehow was able to manufacture large amounts of it without being stopped by the law. Now, he wafted into the Haight-Ashbury area with a seemingly endless supply of this hallucinogenics. Named Captain or Cappy Alfred Hubbard, Alfred Hubbard was reputed to be one of the original Johnny Appleseeds of LSD, travelling across the continent, handing out his wares to anybody that seemed even remotely interested. And he basically, often this was completely free. And he was one of the first people to actually talk about LSD as being used as a transcendental drug, to sort of, to basically go on a journey in your mind. Now, he had a very strange childhood. He described himself as a barefoot hillbilly living in the mountains of Kentucky. One thing that he was very fortunate was he was often visited by angels, which is nice. On one occasion, basically, when he was only 18, these angels actually visited him and told him how to make an over-unity device, or a free energy device, called the Hubbard Energy Transformer. It was a perpetual motion device, and it's actually there, and that's the thing there that looks like a copper wire. Apparently it worked, and he sold the patent to the Radium Chemical Company of Pittsburgh for $75,000, and it has never been seen since. During the Prohibition era, he actually worked as a bootlegger. He was moving alcohol across the Canadian border, and he'd set up a fake taxi firm and basically had ship-to-shore radios on the cab radio, and was able to sort of direct people. what's strange is that basically when this operation sort of went haywire, he disappeared for 18 months. He claims that he was in prison, but there is actually no record of him being in prison at any time. What's more likely was that basically, seeing as he worked for the OSS, he was actually helping the federal government press charges against the bootleggers all along. Somehow, when he later emerged, he was head of security for the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas, which was known to be run by Bugsy Siegel and the Mafia. During World War II, Hubbard expanded his CV yet again. He was approached by the OSS, which is now the CIA, and offered a job that utilised his smuggling expertise. He was actually smuggling weapons into the UK, and this was before the attack of Pearl Harbor, and before America actually formally entered the war. He was made into a Canadian citizen as part of his cover, and actually was provably handled millions and millions of dollars, which were laundered through the Canadian consulate in order to finance the CIA operations in Europe. Now, according to researcher Ben Metcalf, who actually writes in the Vancouver magazine, Hubbard was actually involved in the Manhattan Project in some way. Basically, the Manhattan Project was the creation of the first atomic bomb. Hubbard claims that he was the person that actually transported the uranium out of Fort Radium and took it to the Manhattan Club to allow for the actual first bomb to be made. After the war, Hubbard shortly suddenly, out of nowhere again, became wealthy enough to buy his own island and bought a fleet of ships and began calling himself captain. In 1950, the Angels turned up again, which was lucky for him, and basically told him that an important event in human history was going to happen. Later that year, he found out about LSD, and so he decided that this was it. This was his mission, that the Angels had been talking about him, and so he became obsessed with it and started a huge campaign to promote it. He actually introduced thousands of prominent people to the drugs, including scientists, politicians, intelligence officials, diplomats, church figures, and individuals such as Aldous Huxley, Stanley Kubrick, and according to his own claims, His Holiness the Pope. Now, Hubbard was the person that was instrumental in setting up the concept of set and setting. I'm sure none of you people know about this because you'll never have tried that LSD. But basically, when you do take LSD, it's important to have set and setting. If you get a nice, pleasant thing, it will more likely produce a more pleasant response. And Alfred Hubbard was the person that actually first suggested that he do this. Strangely, in the 60s, he actually ended up working for Teledyne. Teledyne was a major defence subcontractor that worked on secret NASA projects that involved testing psychochemical agents on astronauts and pilots in high altitude. At some unknown date, he also seemingly acquired a doctorate degree from the University of Kentucky in Lexington. That's the place where basically Harris Isabel was conducting all those LSD experiments on black inmates. So he managed to get that there, and he listed this on his CV when he later ended up taking a job at the Tavistock Institute ran Stanford Research Institute. Jim Keith, Mass Control, World Control, wrote, one associate of Hubbard was New World Order theorist Willis Harman at the Stanford Research Institute. SRI had earlier received grants from the US Army to research chemical incapacitants. When visited by a representative of the underground press at SRI, Harman told the man, "There's a war going on between your side and mine, and my side is not going to lose." World Net Daily claims to have Freedom of Information Act requests of CIA declassified documents that indicate that Alfred Hubbard was in direct contact and received psychochemical agents directly from Sidney Gottlieb of the Technical Service Division. Now, in 1963, Hubbard arrived on the doorstep of a young Harvard psychologist named Timothy Leary. Hubbard was apparently dressed in an army fatigue with a crew cut, and he had a long gun strapped to his leg. And Leary actually said he blew in with that uniform, laying down the most incredible atmosphere of mystery and flamboyance. Really impressive bullshit. He was pissed off. His Rolls Royce had broken down on the freeway, so he went to a payphone and called Rolls Royce in London. That's the sort of guy he was. He started name dropping like you wouldn't believe. He claimed he was friends with the Pope. And not only did LSD arrive en masse in the Haight-Ashbury area, coinciding strangely with the explosion of youth-driven and rebellious music, but so did several other highly classified formulas. These strange drugs somehow found their way onto the streets. One of them was called STP. STP, it renders people semi-conscious for days at a time. Now, STP was actually used as an incapacitating agent by the CIA, and therefore was highly classified. So the question is, how did that, and phencyclidine or PCP or angel dust, which was from the same laboratory, how did these things end up on the streets? Well, how they ended up on the streets was that basically two gentlemen called Tim Scully and Owsley Stanley, who obviously had connections to the CIA because of this, produced it and let it go en masse. One of the other drugs that was basically sometimes available in Haight-Ashbury, but I don't suggest anyone ever try it, is a drug called BZ. Now, some people might know what BZ is, some people might not. BZ is it's an all-encompassing hallucinogen that makes your entire perception change, so it's like dropping into a virtual reality machine. It lasts for about 7 days straight, and you don't know that you're in a trip. If anyone has ever seen the Tim Robbins film, Jacob's Ladder, that's what it's about. When in his entire life story, he's dying of BZ poisoning, and that's what the film is about. So, you know, it was a real drug. According to former CIA contract employee, agency personnel helped underground chemists set up LSD laboratories during the Summer of Love to monitor events in the acid ghetto. But why? If this assertion is true, would the CIA be interested in keeping tabs on the hippie population? Law enforcement is not a plausible explanation, for there are already dozens of narcs operating in the Haight-Ashbury area. Then what was the motive? A CIA agent who claims to have infiltrated the covert network provided a clue when he referred to the Haight-Ashbury as a human guinea pig farm. MK Ultra Dr. Lewis Jolly on Jolly West also lived in the Haight-Ashbury district in 1967. Apparently, he was merely there to observe the hippie in his natural environment, but we can only speculate what he was really there for. Now deceased, sadly, Eustace Mullins, who wrote the book The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, in the appendix of this book, he actually basically wrote of how the Tavistock Institute, which is the psychological school of thought from England, was very, very influential in the spread of LSD. The present drug culture of the United States is traced in its entirety to this institute, which supervised the Central Intelligence Agency's training programs. The LSD counterculture originated when Sandoz, a Swiss pharmaceutical house owned by S.G. Warburg, developed a new drug called LSD. James Paul Warburg, son of Paul Warburg, who had written the Federal Reserve Act, financed a subsidiary of the Tavistock Institute in the United States called the Institute for Policy Studies, whose director Marcus Raskin was appointed to the National Security Council. James Paul Warburg set up a CIA program to experiment with LSD on CIA agents. Now, there was another influence that was very, very important in the promotion of sort of hippie morals, and this was the Frankfurt School, which was initially based in Germany. Now, the members of the Frankfurt School, basically, they found a flaw in what would be considered traditional Marxist thought. It failed. It failed to unite the workers. When the World Wars came around, according to Marxism, what should have happened is the workers of the world should have gone, we're not doing that, and joined up together and overthrown the bourgeoisie. What they actually did instead was go, oh, all right then, put on uniforms and go to nationalistic levels. Now, Marxists such as Georgi Lukács and Antonio Gramsci basically felt that Western culture was too strong. The easy pleasures that were provided by Western culture were just too nice, and there's no way that anybody would ever want to sort of be drawn out of it. It would be too painful for them. And they also felt that basically you could only change society from within. Now, the Frankfurt School, a lot of people say, oh, it's a Marxist thing, and there's this concept called cultural Marxism, which is apparently a Soviet plot to subvert Western culture. It's not. The Frankfurt School was actually financed by millionaire Felix Weil, and it was also financed by the Tavistock organisation and British intelligence, who also, by the way, financed the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, it started in 1924 called the School of Marxism, but then it changed to the School of Social Sciences before finally setting on the Frankfurt School. And in 1933, because essentially all these guys were mostly Jewish, they moved to Columbia University in America to avoid the Nazi regime. And so they began to apply Marxist theory to culture as opposed to purely economic terms, and they introduced Freudian psychoanalysis into the picture, claiming essentially that Western culture, everything about Western culture, causes psychological damage and psychological repression. It sounds kind of radical and stuff like that until you actually read Freud and you realise that basically that's just Freud's reality principle. It's not that radical. The Tavistock Institute as well was called the Freud Hilton because of its use of psychoanalysis. And one of the most prevalent academic ideas that came from the Frankfurt School was the concept of critical theory. Now, in essence, this is a critique of any and all institutions of Western culture and questioning the hegemony of the culture. Prominent theorists from Frankfurt include Wilhelm Reich, who spoke about the dangers of sexual alienation as well as orgasmic mind control and aliens. Erich Fromm, who spoke about the constructed nature of sexual roles and the use of fear in advertising. Kurt Lewin, who would later become the director of the Tavistock Institute in the 1930s, and Adorno and Horkheimer, who wrote The Dialectic of Enlightenment and the Culture Industry. Some people, including John Coleman, think that Adorno and Horkheimer were the people that actually wrote the Beatles' music. I don't know if I agree with that personally, but some people will tell you that is true. Herbert Marcuse also was very important. He wrote One-Dimensional Man and Eros and Civilization, and he was also a member of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Now, Marcuse is important because Marcuse was the one that proposed that students could be agents of change rather than the working class. And more importantly, in his books, he gave the academic and moral justification for lots and lots of sex. And you see, sex was used by the free love generation. It all came out of the Frankfurt School. And this was used to move students away from politicization, and critical theory was used to make the emerging counterculture rebel against established ideas. So you're just criticizing this, criticizing this, and then we're off and we're having our free love, and it's fantastic. The only problem with this is essentially critical theory has no end result. So people that think, this is a Marxist plot, blah, 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 it's not. All that critical theory does, it offers no solutions. You just sit there and criticize. You criticize and criticize and criticize, feel incredibly superior, and nothing comes of it. And it's to say, it's disguised or framed as a Marxist plot as well, which at the time as well must have seemed pretty damn exotic and exciting to all these people. So this is the beret wearing people and stuff like that. Aldous Huxley tellingly noted that the 21st century would be the age of controllers. The older dictators failed because they could never supply their subjects with enough bread, enough circuses. Under a scientific dictatorship, men will grow up to love their servitude. Now, Aldous Huxley actually approached Timothy Leary and convinced him to start and form a secret society, and the purpose of this was to spread the message of LSD. Huxley apparently wanted to employ a psychedelic conspiracy to covertly influence powerful members of society for the betterment of mankind. Huxley said to Leary, "Initiate and ensnare artists, writers, jazz musicians, elegant courtesans, and they will educate the intelligent rich." Now, members of the rock group The Warlocks, which was later renamed to the Grateful Dead, were also test subjects in LSD experiments in Palo Alto in 1962. What's more disturbing is that in 1968 an FBI memo came out that said, "Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead are CIA assets. The Grateful Dead are employed to channel youth dissent and rebellion into more benign and non-threatening directions. They perform a vital service in distracting young people into drugs and mysticism rather than politics." Just to make that clear, the Grateful Dead are not a band of musicians that were turned on to the CIA. They were a bunch of CIA agents that were told to pick up musical instruments. Another interesting thing is that Charles Manson actually took his first LSD trip and completely lost his mind and thought that he was Christ at a Grateful Dead concert. So Timothy Leary, LSD champion and counterculture hero, conducted all of his acid-based experiments at Harvard University under the sponsorship of the CIA. In his autobiography Flashbacks, Leary credited the CIA agent Cord Meyer with helping him to understand his political cultural role more clearly. Some people might know who Cord Meyer was. Cord Meyer was head of the CIA Operation Mockingbird. Mockingbird, as some people might know, is the influencing of journalists and the planting of false stories that go along with the CIA's goals, and they plant false stories to disrupt activist groups. Now, the first person to introduce LSD to Timothy Leary was CIA agent and longtime friend Frank Barron. Leary actually spoke in an interview and said, "If you look back, many things that we thought were accidents turned out they were not. The entire LSD movement itself was sponsored originally by the CIA, to whom I give great credit. 80% of the decisions I made were suggested to me by CIA people. I like the CIA. Yes, I am a witting agent of the CIA." Some people have taken that to be some sort of confession. Now, similarly to Ewan Cameron and William Sargent, Leary was actually experimenting with removing and replacing behaviour patterns. That's what he decided that LSD was useful for. As we said previously, his mentor at Harvard was Henry Murray, who in the 1940s was employed to develop personality tests for the CIA and monitored military experiments on truth drugs, brainwashing and interrogation. This is Michael Hollingshead. Michael Hollingshead was basically an MI6 agent. He was the first person that supplied Leary with a steady and large supply of LSD. And Hollingshead basically was sent by the Tavistock Institute and Aldous Huxley to provide Timothy Leary with the LSD. Among those that Hollingshead is reputed to have introduced to LSD are Timothy Leary, William Burroughs, Roman Polanski, Allen Ginsberg, Donovan, Keith Richards, Charlie Mingus, artist Saul Steinberg, Alan Watts, and the Beatles, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and George Harrison. The episode where Hollingshead actually provided acid for the Beatles is actually in the John Lennon biography. It says, Spring 1965, John Lennon, Cynthia, George Harrison, and Pattie Boyd inadvertently take their first LSD trip when a dentist friend of Harrison's, supplied by LSD Johnny Appleseed, Michael Hollingshead, spikes their coffee. Right, I'm sure some of you might have heard of the Paul is dead theory. Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure that I believe that, although I've seen some very, very strange sort of stuff around that. What is interesting is that basically, if Paul was replaced, at the first interview, certainly the first interview after his car crash, we cut his lip and whatnot, so the first potential interview with the fake Paul or Fall, the whole interview is promoting LSD. That's all it's about. So it's just something to think about. Lennon also spoke about his acid use, and actually it was publicised in a Playboy article which was released very, very shortly after his death. He was asked about acid and he said, "Not in years. A little mushroom or peyote is not beyond my scope. Maybe twice a year. But you don't really hear about it anymore. And people still are visiting the cosmos. And we must always remember to thank the CIA and the Army for LSD." So, he was very, very clear about this. And so this article was released very, very shortly after he died. And the John Lennon thing is also obviously very tangentially connected. Roman Polanski connected to the Manson films at the Dakota Building. Anton LaVey's in the film. John Lennon was shot apparently by Mark Chapman, but he wasn't. He was shot by a bloke called Jose Padermo, who was a CIA agent that worked with Frank Sturgis, and he was the doorman on that particular night. Never before, never again. On that night, he was the doorman. But don't think that's suspicious anyway, obviously. Now, in an interview for High Times in February 1978, Leary reminisced. "If you look back, many things that we thought were accidents turned out were not accidents. The entire LSD movement itself was sponsored originally by the CIA, to whom I give great credit. I would not be here today if I had not been for the foresight and the prestige of the CIA psychologists. So give the CIA credit for being a truly an intelligence agency." Walter Bauer, who wrote the book Operation Mind Control, which again another book that I would recommend everybody get, interviewed Leary in the 70s. And he asked him, "Do you think the CIA was involved in your group in the 60s? And Leary responded, "Of course they were. I'd say 80% of my movements, 80% of my decisions were suggested to me by CIA people. I like the CIA. The game they play is better than the FBI. It's better than the Saigon police. It's better than Franco's police. It's better than the Israeli police. They're 1,000 times better than the KGB. So it comes down to who you're going to work for, the Yankees or the Dodgers." When Timothy Leary left Harvard, he was lucky enough to immediately fall into the good graces of somebody that allowed him to carry on his CIA-sponsored experimentation. He began to work for William Mellon Hitchcock, who founded the CIA front group, the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, which was later renamed the Castilla Foundation. Hitchcock was well positioned to help Leary with the vast wealth that came from his enviable position as heir to the Gulf Oil Company fortune, and when Leary was no longer welcome to conduct experiments at Harvard, he was paid $2,000 a month and provided accommodation to live and conduct his psychedelic research on the 2,500-acre Mellon Hitchcock estate. William Billy Mellon Hitchcock was a graduate of the University of Vienna and a descendant of the millionaire Mellon banking family of Pittsburgh. His ancestor Andrew Mellon had risen to the position of U.S. Treasury Secretary during the Prohibition era. And so what he did was he contacted this company called the Charles Bruce Company, which is based out of England, and arranged for large quantities of the precursors to all these psychedelic drugs to be sent through his firm. They also did this with George Grant Hogue, who was the heir to J.C. Penney. J.C. Penney is like a design, it's a store in America, and so these are prominent people. It was also Hitchcock that introduced Timothy Leary to a very important person who will come to in a second, called Owsley Stanley. The other thing that Hitchcock was trying to do was he got in touch with a law firm called Bowden and Stanley 27 and was trying to figure out which Caribbean country would be the best place to produce and distribute large quantities of LSD and hash. So, Owsley Stanley. Right, Owsley Stanley, you might have heard of him. He's Owsley Gold and stuff like this. He was a very prominent LSD cook in the 1960s. He was nicknamed Bear due to his particularly hirsute figure, and he was reportedly one of the first independent sources to produce very, very large quantities of LSD. He apparently was fabled to have produced 0.5 kilogram of LSD, which translates to about 5 million hits. Now, although accounts of this output vary widely, what is undisputed, however, is the widespread and low-cost availability of his incredibly high-quality and potent LSD basically helps the flower power genre. Without Owsley Stanley, there would have been no hippie scene. And again, more often than not, his entire stockpile was given away to people completely free. Previously, STP and PCP were also released into the streets by Owsley Stanley and his associate Tim Scully. You see, he's another one that comes from a long line of elite families. He's born Augustus Owsley Stanley III. His grandfather of the same name had been the governor of Kentucky. He'd also been a US senator and a very, very prominent congressman. His father was also a veteran of active service in the US Army, and after his parents separated, he was sent to military school. He was actually expelled from Charlotte Hall Military School for bringing alcohol onto campus and getting his friends pissed. And then afterwards, he voluntarily spent a year at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington. St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, as you may remember, was where they were doing the truth serum experimentation with people like George Hunter White. He later actually joined the US Air Force, and he became highly skilled as electronics, and then later went on to work on radio stations, whilst also rather eclectically being a performing ballet dancer. Now, in 1963, he enrolled in university, began enthusiastically smoking marijuana, and started a fledgling business selling hallucinogenic seeds. Now, the next year he found out about LSD and decided that he was so enthusiastic about it that he became obsessed with its chemistry and started to learn how to make it and how to make it stronger and how to make large quantities, and set up an organisation called the Bear Research Group, and basically began producing LSD on an industrial scale. With his associate Tim Scully, Stanley built a large laboratory situated in Port Richmond, San Francisco, in order to continue the industrial scale production needs that were required. LSD was declared illegal in California in 1966, and at this time he moved his operation to a secret site that was hidden next to the Denver Zoo. Now, Stanley, he was far bolder. He didn't care. Basically, what he did at all times was carry his entire stash around in his suitcase. At one time, he was arrested, and I believe he had 350,000 separate tabs of LSD in his suitcase, which he steadfastly maintained were for his own personal use. He was later apprehended on tour with the Grateful Dead. Basically, strangely, he was arrested, the Grateful Dead were not arrested, and he was imprisoned for 3 years beginning in 1970. But yet again, we can see the connections to wealth, high society, mental health institutions, the military, and the intelligence agencies as a running thread through all these people. So this was a control scenario, wasn't it, this LSD? And the problem was that basically a lot of it was quite nice. A lot of it was really working out well for people. A lot of things didn't go so well. So how could we possibly taint this hippie generation, do you think? How could we would there be someone that we could perhaps utilise to give hippies a bad name? Yes. Now, I've lost my place. Now, it appears that the Manson family's own supply of LSD came directly from the CIA. Now, Orange Sunshine was being used exclusively by the Manson family and its entourage during their many drug sessions in the desert. This has been mentioned in numerous books. In Charles Tex Watson's book, he basically mentions Orange Sunshine. He blames that for basically sending him insane and making him believe Manson's helter-skelter. We'll come on to that in a bit. But Also in Ed Sanders' The Family, Gypsy, who's one of the girls, talks about Orange Sunshine. Brenda and various other Manson family girls have also talked about their like for Orange Sunshine. The only thing is that they could only have got it from one source, and that's Owsley Stanley, who is directly connected to the intelligence agency. Now, the Manson family and I'm sure people are quite familiar with the concept of like helter skelter, and you've perhaps seen the film, perhaps have read the books and stuff like that. It's all garbage. Absolutely every single bit of it is garbage. None of the helter-skelter thing is true at all. One thing that's particularly strange is that Charles Manson, before his arrest, never had a beard. Never had hair longer than here, and actually encouraged people on the ranch, on the Spahn Ranch, and later at the Barker Ranch, to cut their hairs conservatively and dress like cowboys. He disliked hippies. He didn't like the Beatles' music. He thought it was okay, but he was a big fan of Bing Crosby. If you listen to Charles Manson's albums, the two that he put out, Lied and stuff like that, none of them sound anything like the Beatles. They sound more akin to sort of the Laurel Canyon scene, to be quite honest. They're very countrified, and they include such titles as Never Do Anything Illegal. He actually described himself. He says, if you're going to call yourself hippies and you want to do this thing, fine, but you're asking for trouble. The hippies are asking for trouble. So if you're going to designate yourself this, designate yourself slippies instead. What's strange is that basically during his trial, as I said, he was refused a razor and refused to cut his hair. So when he was finally presented to the public, the first real time that the public saw Charles Manson, by sheer coincidence, he looked like Jesus. And therefore you can tie this concept of communal living back to hippies and basically connect it to Charles Manson. The Beatles stuff, I'm sure you've heard about this. Their hair was as fire and they had electric breastplates and stuff like that. It's all connected to Revelation number 9 out of the book. We know this to be true because this is the concept of helter skelter that Bugliosi talked about. Only problem with this is it's all completely lies. As I say, he wasn't a Beatles fan. The person that came up with the concept of helter skelter as connected to the Beatles was a chap called Little Paul Watkins. Him and Susan Atkins used to sit on acid and talk about the Beatles. Charlie didn't think the Beatles were speaking him to the record. Susan thought the Beatles were speaking to her through the record, but she was mad as a sack of tits. So, we don't really tend to take her very seriously. Manson has claimed, I was a beatnik. I ain't no teeny bopper. Hippies are just kids to me. And as I say, he didn't actually grow his hair long until his trial. We all know that Manson is a huge racist. He was trying to start a black and white race war. Again, this is not true. What people don't seem to realise is that one of Charles Manson's good friends whilst he was in prison was Black Panther Geronimo Pratt. This doesn't come from Charles Manson, this comes from Geronimo Pratt's autobiography. But Neil, he's got a swastika on his forehead and he joined the Aryan Brotherhood, yada 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 yada. What a lot of people don't realise is that he was kicked out of the Aryan Brotherhood for refusing to attack a black man. The swastika on his forehead as well, initially it was left facing, later it was right facing. People have asked him about this. It was taken from a Native American friend of his, a chap called Walks on Top. Walks on Top was put in solitary confinement, and they threw Manson in because they didn't like Manson. They wanted him to get beaten up by it. Manson got on incredibly well with him. Bobby Bosley was a racist. Danny DiCarlo was a racist. Tex Watson was a racist. Brendan McCann was a racist. Charles Manson was not a racist. All of those four people have said, actually, Charles Manson used from down south. He got on with black people more than anybody. What he was talking about was black Muslims, and this is a very specific group of black Muslims had spoken to him in prison about possibly attacking white people. This actually happened. There was a series of murders in the late 60s and early 70s by a group of Muslims, a very specific group of black Muslims that this isn't what Muslims are like, this is what this particular group of idiots were like. They called themselves the Death Angels or the Zebra Killers, and basically their job was to kill as many white people as possible. This was a real and genuine case and involved several of the black Muslims that coincidentally went to prison with Charles Manson before the 60s. You see, in Helter Skelter as well, you get this concept that basically he was controlling people with mind control and stuff like that. He was certainly a very charismatic man. One of the things that he did, the sort of repeating questions back to people, I like to stay on the ranch, I like to stay on the ranch. Can I stay on the ranch? Can I stay on the ranch? And he'd do that. He'd basically, if you've seen in interviews with him, he would say, repeat things back to people. That's a Scientology practice. I forget exactly what it was. He was a Scientologist. He was trained, he was audited to the point of being theta level clear, which is the highest accolade that you can actually achieve in Scientology. It was done by a bloke called Lanier Raymer whilst he was in prison, and an auditing machine was actually found on the ranch during the infamous raid in 1969. Scientology was started by L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard is Office of Naval Intelligence. He was friends with Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons, and it started suspiciously exactly the same time that MK Ultra started. Some of the CIA documentation appears to have been copied directly from the CIA QBARC manual. The interrogation, the auditing process, which uses a lie detector, is taken directly from the QBARC manual. The other thing that's strange is that Manson basically, like a lot of serial killers, there was elements of trauma-based mind control in his past. He was, sent to Boys Town, which some people might know is connected to the Franklin scandal. He was also sent to school by his Uncle Jess, dressed as a girl, to toughen him up, which is exactly the same thing that happened to serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, who went on to chalk up over 350 bodies. He was also in various prisons at the time when the CIA was known to be testing drugs on people. When he was later in Vacaville in 1975, which was after the killings, he did an interview with a bloke called Newell Emmons, and he's clearly under the effects of psychotropic drugs in there. It was at this time that Charles Manson started sending letters to people talking about his love affair that he had with Peter Falk. Peter Falk, Peter Falk? Columbo? Yeah, they were lovers. Charles Manson and Peter Falk were lovers. He also had an affair with Cary Grant. He also turned down Dina Martin, the daughter of Dean Martin. So he was friends with Neil Young. He was friends with Neil Diamond. He was friends with The Doors. He was friends with the Beach Boys. He sold at least 2 songs to the Beach Boys that appeared on the 2020 album. One of them was Cease to Exist, or Never Learn Not to Love, as it was renamed, but there are others that are there at the same time. Now here's the interesting thing. Why was the Beatles connected to Manson, when in actual fact Manson was more connected to the Beach Boys? Well, who were the Beach Boys' biggest rivals? The Beatles. It's as simple as that. Nick Grillo, who was the manager of the Beach Boys, as far as I can see, the Beatles aspect was to protect Paramount Studios, Brother Records, the Beach Boys, and Warner Brothers, including people like Robert Evans, who were involved with the dealing of cocaine to the Hollywood elite. Here's an interesting thing. Everybody's seen the Abbey Road thing, where they're walking like this, and it looks suspiciously Masonic on the black and white thing. That was taken on August the 8th. That's the day that the Tate murders took place. So, Orange Sunshine Lsd was manufactured and distributed exclusively by the group known as the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, who operated out of a beach resort near Los Angeles. The Brotherhood had among its drug manufacturers one Ronald Stark, who is believed to have manufactured 50 million doses of LSD. He was a CIA agent. Timothy Leary was also involved in the group, and Owsley Stanley was one of the principal cooks for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Now, Orange Sunshine, produced by the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, mysteriously reared its head at another seminal moment of the 60s, namely the drugs bust on the Rolling Stones in February 1967. Now, the Orange Sunshine had been provided to them by a shadowy figure called David Schneiderman. David Schneiderman was described by Mick Jagger as being a shadowy and sinister Yank who claimed to work for intelligence agencies and had 10 passports. He was the person that provided the acid to the Rolling Stones and then was mysteriously allowed to go completely free, walking past the police without his suitcase, with all different types of drugs being examined. It later transpired, it came out last year, that actually not only was he a CIA agent, he was acting on the part of COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO was an anti-activist movement that was set up by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI to discredit the Black Panthers and certain activist groups. And that is why we used to have Street Fighting Man, and now we have Sir Mick Jagger. 1968, the Rolling Stones tour manager was this gentleman, Phil Kaufman. Kaufman held the distinction of being a jailhouse buddy of none other than Charles Manson. This was prior to his release in 1967, and Kaufman maintained a relationship with the Manson family after his release. Kaufman was the person that actually got Charles Manson jobs singing and playing guitar in mafia-run nightclubs in Hollywood and the Los Angeles area. He described himself as a sympathetic cousin to the family. Phil Kaufman was actually immortalised in a film called Grand Theft Parsons, and this details how Phil Kaufman stole the corpse of Graham Parsons, who we spoke about in the previous bit, and transported his dead body across state lines and then burnt it, incinerated it in Joshua Tree. Now, it's quite a good film. It's a very strange scenario, certainly. In that film, Graham Parsons is played by the ringleader of the Jackass television show, Johnny Knoxville. In Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, they basically take orange sunshine. This drug is so potent that on their arrival in Las Vegas, he believes that all the patrons have turned into large reptilian aliens. Later in the actual book, his companion Dr. Gonzo spikes a 13-year-old girl with LSD in order to be able to sodomize her. The Ultimate concert. So, it was this very same type of LSD, Orange Sunshine, which saturated the fateful free concert held at the Ultimate Speedway in 1969. This is the one where basically 4 people died, and the black gentleman was stabbed to death by the Hells Angels during the song Sympathy for the Devil. Basically, the Hells Angels ran security for this concert, and they'd been given thousands and thousands of doses of LSD. It was all Orange Sunshine. It was provided directly by Owsley Stanley, and it was tainted. It was also mixed with amphetamines. It was a bad dose, and basically there was 14,000 hits there. Within half an hour, the entire festival had run out of Thorazine. Thorazine is the only thing that can combat a bad trip, and so essentially thousands of people had the worst time on that particular day. The Hells Angels, who provided security for that particular thing, at the time, it must be told, this is true, it sounds nuts, they were in the employ of the CIA. This might sound strange, but the ATF and the CIA hired Sonny Barger as an informant and a hitman. Sonny Barger is the founder of the Hells Angels. Barger was employed in an attempt on the life of Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver and Cesar Chavez. He failed in the second hit because he was unfortunately arrested halfway through doing it. Orange Sunshine was reportedly heavily used by American ground forces in Vietnam, and it was smuggled into the country from California. Now, this is particularly impressive, bearing in mind that all official sources will tell you that the Brotherhood of Eternal Love was essentially 12 people. Now, that's their van that they transported it to Vietnam in, apparently. Now, Timothy Leary, along with CIA agent Ronald Stark, went to work in organising the distribution wing of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love's operation. Stark was arrested in Bologna, Italy for drug trafficking in 1975 and was released on the ground that he had been a CIA agent since 1960. Stark helped Leary found the quasi-religious Brotherhood of Eternal Love as a cover for the distribution of this particularly potent Orange Sunshine, and all the volunteers from the Brotherhood of Eternal Love were taken from the Billy Hitchcock Mellon estate, and it was all manufactured there under the watchful eyes of the Mellons. Here's an interesting thing. This is important. When Timothy Leary was imprisoned, he was broken out of prison by a group called the Weather Underground. Are people familiar with the Weather Underground? They were supposedly a left-wing activist group. No, I'm sorry, I'm afraid they were CIA, right from their inception. This is what happens, you create these activist groups, because if you're going to win a race, you own all the horses. This is what's even more important, is that the Weather Underground are the people that politicised and directly connected hippies with Charles Manson. When the Manson murders happened, the Weather Underground basically said, this is a political movement, and championed him. They said, dig it. They killed those rich white pigs in there. They ate dinner in the same room, and they even left a fork in the body of the dead. In 1969, the Weather Underground declared Charles Manson Man of the Year, and declared 1969 the year of the fork. It's the Weather Underground, who's obviously a CIA agent. Basically, they helped Timothy Leary break out of prison, and they also are the people that basically painted the public perception of the Manson family. Now, in the beginning, the Brotherhood handed out merry free samples of LSD to promote the product, but by the middle of 1969, the organisation had already distributed 10 million hits of this particularly strong LSD. One of those that worked for them was a 12-year-old called Daryl Baranski, aged 12 at the time, but several years later he was arrested along with several military men as part of an undercover military operation moving marijuana from Asia to California. Leary was eventually arrested with Joanna Harcourt Smith, who was another member of the Brotherhood, who later admitted to be working for the DEA. When Charles Manson was placed in solitary confinement at Folsom Prison in late 1969, one of the people that was placed in the cell next to him was Timothy Leary. Now, Timothy Leary had this to say about the Brotherhood. The whole concept of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love is like a bogeyman invented by the narcs. The Brotherhood was about 8 surfer kids from Southern California, and they just took LSD, and they practiced the religion of worship of nature, and they'd go into the mountains. They were not the big shots at all. None of them ever drove anything better than a VW bus. They were just kind of into it for the spiritual thrill. Now, I think we need to say by this time that we probably don't trust a lot of what Timothy Leary says, and despite his proclamation that basically, as I say, there were a group of 8 to 12 surfer kids that basically moved LSD around in a VW van, that doesn't really explain how it managed to sort of infiltrate such a wide premise. You know, Hollywood, the east coast of America, England, Vietnam, every single significant event that was involved in the destruction of the love generation and the flower power generation was intricately implemented by Orange Sunshine. So thank you very much. That concludes my talk, so hopefully that's not left you too disillusioned.
Don't you think Phil Spector was a very clever name for what he was doing?
Yes, that's it. Do you know, Brian Wilson thought that Phil Spector was trying to kill him?
Really?
Yeah, seriously. He didn't, it wasn't. Because Brian Wilson was insane. I mean, to Brian Wilson, if people don't know, he spent a year in bed. He spent a year in a sandpit, and he spent another year in a swimming pool. The first time that he went to Brother Records, this is the first time in years that they managed to drag him into the actual offices, and he was in there for 5 minutes and started getting a bit twitchy, and he says, I'm sorry, I can't continue this conversation, we're not carrying on this conversation. Okay, fair enough, why? And so he explained to the head of the record company that the trees outside were hungry and that they needed to drive down to the town, get some tin spaghetti and bury them. He was mad, he was absolutely mad. But yeah, I mean, I'm here if anyone wants to ask me any questions. If anybody's interested, I do have some copy of bullets to get them out. I do have some books for sale. I've only got a couple of copies. It's called Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own. Is that one basically? The first one details MK Ultra and all the sort of nuts and bolts, assassins, that sorts of thing. The second looks at social control, media, the hippies, and the sort of thing that we've been talking about today. So if anybody wants to get a copy, they're on my website. They're £15 each. Whenever I do live talks, I do 2 for £22 basically. So if anybody wants some, come and get me. And if anyone's got any questions, but thank you very much for listening. You've been great. Thank you very much.
My God, he's tall, isn't he? Any questions, anyone?
Don't be shy. Yeah.
I was going to ask a couple of things, really.
Yeah.
Firstly,
Tell you what, hold on. Can we take the mic off? Somehow do bring it over there. Just bear with me. Just some.
obviously you've covered the origins of LSD and mind control, but how long do you think it was going on for? Do you think it's still going on today in the industry? And how prevalent do you think it is today?
Oh yeah, very prevalent. Yeah, very prevalent. I mean, that's one of the things. SSRIs and that sort of drug, they tend to they soften everything off. It's remarkably similar to the concept of Soma, basically. Yeah, MK Ultra is still going. It's been redesignated. A chap called Ted Goodness once told me it's now called MK Marathon. Whether you could prove that or not, who knows? But yeah, there's certainly mind control programs going on, social control programs going on. It's whenever a new drug comes onto the scene, you've always got these gurus that basically tell you about it. How do people find out about it? I'll tell you one thing I've noticed recently, right? MCAT, methadone, all these sort of drugs, I didn't find out about them until people were telling you about it in the papers. Dappy gets caught doing it. Oh, brilliant. It's almost like it's an advertisement for it. I saw something in the Daily Mail the other day. Yeah, exactly. Pink ecstasy. Beware of this pink ecstasy. It's so dangerous. It killed 4 people. And it's very cheap. Crack, when crack came out, right, okay, this new highly addictive form of smokable cocaine, you can be like the elite but for pennies. Oh yeah, oh right, yeah. No, come on, watch all those things again. And basically, all they're doing is promoting the drugs. And so, yeah, mind control's broad. It's not just sort of personal things. It's not just drugs. It's social control. It's sort of this sort of thing. It's perception management and sort of like arranging people's thought processes, really. So yeah, it is still carrying on. Anybody else?
I was just going to ask, is there any truth in Courtney Love's dad was supposed to be a Untitled Chapter?
Oh right, Courtney Love's. I know that she basically, he's not very fond of her. She was part of a hippie cult when she was younger. And he claims that they took lots of acid and stuff like that. He claims that he kicked her out because she was being a prostitute when she was 15. I'd not heard that, but I will look into that. I can believe it.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Who the bloody hell's Courtney Love?
Oh, she was a lead singer of a band called Hole, and she murdered a bloke called Kurt Cobain.
You're still a bit too soon for Dave, I'm afraid.
Stop listening to the crap and watching that crap telly.
Had ties with the CIA.
Did he?
And obviously,
It doesn't surprise me.
Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
Who was that, sorry?
Courtney Love's dad apparently said had ties with the CIA.
Yeah.
He condones the murder theory. He reckons she.
Yeah, I've heard that. He does. Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly very possible. Like, you know, this is the point. The end. Bob Hope apparently was not really a comedian as well. He was an espionage agent, and you know, he didn't write any of the jokes. He just read it. He was just a presenter.
What about Shirley MacLaine and Warren Beatty?
Yeah.
Wasn't they come from CIA? Family?
They're brother and sister.
Yeah, but their dad was in the.
Yeah. Warren Beatty appeared in a when the Tate LaBianca murders happened. The police went there and found a series of high-class sex films. One of them including Sharon Tate having sex with a dog. Peter Sellers was there having sex with Sadie Atkins, and Warren Beatty was there having sex with Sadie Atkins. There was also one of Yul Brynner, Peter Sellers, and Warren Beatty having sex with each other.
Madonna at the Super Bowl.
Oh, glad I never said that.
It's true. Hiya.
I'd always thought that some of the CIA stuff was simply hardline right-wing stuff, and their definition of control was as every big-headed person at the top of society, I want my empire bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
Are they still imagining they're going to do that, or do they? It seems to have gone so bizarre it can't possibly happen. And not that that's
I tend to think the separation between groups like CIA, Mossad, like with the Cold War and stuff, I don't think it's real. I don't think that there is a need for them to become an empire, because there are separate branches of this empire all over the place. And then you've got other agencies like the NSA and even more secret agencies. Basically, they're called three-letter agencies, and there's dozens of these things, and what they do, and you know, God only knows. They certainly killed Kennedy because he was going to split them up. So you know, they've got some power.
They may have power, but are they nutcases?
Yeah.
Can't be controlled,
Yeah.
as opposed to people who've got an agenda. Take Mrs. Thatcher, like her or not like her. She had a clearly thought out economic plan. She did not herself use anything. She actually was in reality as narrow-minded and consistent.
She was an MI5 agent, you do know that?
Even so, she would have to be. She knew how to manipulate people. But she had an agenda with a clear set of right-wing people who are going to get a benefit.
Well, maybe. I mean,
who's going to get any benefit?
well, I don't really know about that, to be honest. But basically, one of the two things is going to happen. Basically, you're either going to, if you're doing anything that's going against the consensus agenda, one or two things is going to happen. Your career is going to die. Or one of three things is going to happen. Your career is going to die. You're going to die like Robin Cook, or you're going to end up with a amyl nitrate laced orange in your mouth wearing stockings. Okay, that's what's going to happen. So you may well be correct. I don't know enough about that. I see what you're saying, because I think what you're getting at is the sort of, she was not keen on going into the European Union or that sort of thing, and so that was perhaps why she was destroyed, because she was doing that. But you know, one good deed in a lifetime of being an absolute arsehole doesn't get you anything in my book, I'm afraid. Yes, please.
In your investigations and your research, how much are you finding that paedophilia is what is holding a lot of this together.
How much am I finding that paedophilia is holding a lot of this together? Yeah, a lot. Absolutely. That's what this Jimmy Savile thing is, that people don't seem to realise. What was going on at Bryn Allen and Kincora and stuff like that is brothels and blackmail scandals. And this was admitted by Ken Livingstone, admitted that Kincora was being used as brothels to try and snare, was it members of the IRA or was it members of, I forget, some Irish parliamentary people. Same thing with Bryn Allen. That's exactly what it's there for. They use it for blackmail purposes. And yeah, it does traumatise the kids as well, which is brilliant. Franklin School. If anyone's interested, just look at the Franklin School and stuff like that. Yeah, but this is exactly what's happening with the Jimmy Savile thing. And this is why these celebrities come out, because basically you've got them in your pocket forever.
Yeah.
Then so.
Does the CIA admit to own on everyone in Hollywood?
Yeah, absolutely, and every journalist and all of this as well. I'm going to have to cut it short there because obviously there's other people there. But if I'm about for the rest of the day, so if people want to come and find me, like I'm here. So thank you very, very much.